A Millionaire's Daughters. A millionaire sees four street girls with faces identical to the woman he loved most in the past. Intrigued, he decides to investigate who these children are, and what he discovers turns his life upside down. The girls are his daughters, and their mother has been unjustly imprisoned for years. Now he must confront his own family and the system to recover lost time and reunite his true family. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We'll continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. Traffic on Fifth Avenue was more congested than usual that Monday afternoon. Richard Matthews drummed his fingers on the steering wheel of his imported BMW, impatiently checking the wristwatch that had cost the equivalent of an apartment in the less affluent neighborhoods of the city. A video conference with Chinese investors awaited him in less than 20 minutes, and he despised tardiness as much as he hated being stuck in traffic. The light turned red again, drawing an exasperated sigh from the 48-year-old executive. It was then that his gaze, previously fixed on the windshield, shifted to the sidewalk. There, among hurried pedestrians and street vendors, were four identical girls in simple, colorful dresses, offering small bouquets of flowers to passers-by. Richard felt his heart skip a beat. Those eyes, the shape of the face, it wasn't possible. He rubbed his eyes, thinking he was having a hallucination. But when he looked again, the four girls were still there. They must have been about 10 years old. Dark, wavy hair framed. Faces that he knew too well. Faces that instantly transported him to a night 12 years ago. "Move it!" The impatient honk from the car behind jolted him from his trance. The light had turned green. Richard accelerated mechanically, but his mind remained on that sidewalk, with those four girls who carried the unmistakable features of Lisa. Lisa Miller. The name he had tried so hard to erase from his memory now resurfaced with the force of Storm, the woman who 12 years earlier had told him she was pregnant, a claim he had dismissed as a lie or confusion. After all, since he was 20, following a severe infection, Richard had carried with him a diagnosis of sterility. The meeting with the Chinese investors was a disaster. Richard, always articulate and focused, stumbled over words, lost his train of thought, forgot numbers that would normally be on the tip of his tongue. When he finally ended the call, he couldn't concentrate on anything else. "Cancel my appointments for the rest of the day," he instructed his secretary, ignoring the surprised look of the woman who, in 5 years, had never seen him alter his schedule. The next day he parked his car in the same spot, and the next and the following one. For a week he observed the girls from a distance. They arrived around 3 in the afternoon, accompanied by a gray-haired woman who appeared to be a caretaker. They sold flowers until dusk, when they walked together to a bus stop. On the 8th day, Richard found his courage. He got out of his car and approached, pretending to be interested in the flowers. Up close, the resemblance was even more disturbing. All four were truly identical, although each had her own way of carrying herself. "How much for the bouquet?" he asked, addressing the girl who seemed to be the spokesperson for the group. $15, sir," she replied, with a politeness that contrasted with her young age. "They're fresh flowers picked today." Richard bought a bouquet from each of them, paying with a $100 bill and refusing the change. The girl who had spoken to him, apparently the most articulate of the group, frowned. "We don't need charity, sir. We work honestly." The response surprised him. There was dignity in that child, dignity and pride. "It's not charity," he replied, feeling awkward. "I just really liked the flowers." That was when the gray-haired woman approached, suspicious of the prolonged interaction. "Any problem, girls?" "None, Mrs. Zelda," replied one of the girls. "The gentleman bought all our flowers." The woman examined him from head to toe, noting the expensive suit and luxury watch. "Very kind of you," she said with a politeness that barely disguised her suspicion. I'd like to know more about these girls," Richard said, unable to contain himself. "They remind me of someone." Mrs. Zelda's expression immediately hardened. "The girls live at Bloom Shelter. where I'm the coordinator. They're under judicial protection. We don't provide information about them to strangers, no matter how well dressed they may be." The response, though harsh, gave Richard what he needed: a name, a place to start his investigation. In the following days, he discreetly hired a private investigator, a man who had previously provided services to his company in cases of industrial espionage. The report arrived a week later. The four girls, Anna, Betty, Caroline, and Danielle, were indeed Lisa Miller's daughters. They had been in the shelter for 2 years, since their mother had been imprisoned for stealing food from a supermarket during the height of the pandemic. The surprisingly severe sentence for a minor offense kept her in a women's penitentiary on the outskirts of New York City. The information had a physical impact on Richard. Sitting in his office on the top floor of one of the most imposing skyscrapers on Madison Avenue, the powerful CEO felt the world spin. Lisa imprisoned, the girls in a shelter, 4 identical girls, quadruplets, with the same almond-shaped eyes that had captured his heart so many years ago. The investigator also brought photos of the shelter, an old, poorly maintained mansion with peeling walls and broken windows. The description of overcrowded dormitories, the scarcity of school supplies, the food always at the limit of insufficiency, awakened something in Richard. A feeling he didn't recognize, a mixture of guilt, indignation, and a strange need for reparation. Without thinking twice, he called the shelter's number, offering himself as a volunteer. He lied about his motivations, inventing a story about corporate social responsibility. Mrs. Zelda, initially reluctant, eventually gave in to the possibility of having an extra pair of hands to help with daily tasks. The following Sunday, Richard parked his car a few blocks from the shelter, exchanged his suit for jeans and a simple t-shirt, and walked to the location. The contrast with his usual life couldn't be greater. Accustomed to luxury hotels, starred restaurants, and meeting rooms with panoramic views, he now found himself in a decaying building where the smell of mold mixed with that of simple food. "I thought you wouldn't come," commented Mrs. Zelda, leading him down the narrow corridor. "Many people promise to help, few actually show up." Richard felt the weight of those words. For how many years had he himself ignored the existence of those girls? For how many years had he doubted Lisa's word, convinced of his own impossibility of being a father? "You can start by carrying these buckets to the laundry," instructed the coordinator, pointing to containers filled with bed sheets. "Then, if you still have the energy, the kitchen needs help preparing lunch." As he carried the heavy buckets down the corridor, Richard spotted, through a half-open door, the 4 girls sitting in a circle on the floor of a tiny room. They were playing an improvised card game made with pieces of repurposed paper. Upon noticing his presence, they interrupted their game, staring at him with identical expressions of curiosity and distrust. One of them, he still couldn't tell them apart, stood up and positioned herself protectively in front of her sisters. Another began methodically collecting the cards, as if fearing he might take away the precious toy. The third observed him with analytical eyes, as if evaluating every detail of his person. The fourth, smaller than the others by a few centimeters, hid partially behind her protective sister, but her eyes, the same eyes as Lisa's, shone with a curiosity she couldn't disguise. "Hello," Richard said, his voice betraying the nervousness he felt. I came to help at the shelter today." None of the 4 responded. The silence stretched, uncomfortable, until Mrs. Zelda reappeared in the corridor. "I see you've already met our little flowers," she commented. "Girls, this is Mr. Richard. He's going to volunteer on Sundays." "Why?" abruptly asked the girl who had stood up first, the protector. "What does he get out of it?" The question, direct and suspicious, caught Richard by surprise. At that moment, facing those 4 identical pairs of eyes that could be his, he realized that the journey ahead would be much more complex and challenging than he had imagined. In the following weeks, Richard established a routine he had never imagined for himself. Every Sunday, he exchanged his Italian suits for simple clothes and drove to Bloom Shelter. He carried boxes, fixed faucets, painted walls, helped in the kitchen. His hands, previously accustomed only to signing million-dollar contracts and holding crystal glasses now knew calluses and scratches. The girl's distrust persisted, especially Betty's, the protector, as Richard had learned to identify her. Always vigilant, she observed every movement of the stranger, who appeared weekly with eyes that seemed much older than her 10 years. Anna, the most organized, kept her distance, but Richard noticed how she meticulously managed her sister's few belongings. On one occasion, while helping to tidy the tiny room that the four shared with 3 other children, Richard observed how Anna carefully folded each one's clothes, discreetly marking them to distinguish them. "Each has a color," explained Mrs. Zelda, who supervised the work. "Anna created a system with colored threads on the labels. It's the only way they know what belongs to whom, being so similar." Caroline, the artist, was easier to approach. One afternoon, while painting a cafeteria wall, Richard noticed the girl watching him curiously. Without saying anything, he offered her a brush. Hesitantly, she accepted. In a few minutes, what should have been a simple white paint job transformed into an improvised mural with delicate flowers emerging from the child's skillful hands. "You have a lot of talent," commented Richard, genuinely impressed. Caroline shrugged, but a small smile betrayed her pride. "Mom used to draw too," she replied, before suddenly falling silent as if she had said too much. Danielle, the youngest by a few minutes and the smallest of the 4, was an enigma. She rarely spoke, but was always present, observing everything, with eyes that seemed to absorb every detail. One Sunday, when Richard arrived at the shelter, he found her sitting alone in the small backyard garden, contemplating a single flower sprouting between cracks in the concrete. "It's beautiful," he commented, crouching beside the girl. Danielle didn't respond, but extended her hand, gently touching the small yellow flower. "You know what I see?" continued Richard, pointing to the plant. "I see strength, growing in a difficult place with little space, little water, and still making something so beautiful. That's real strength." The girl turned to him, studying his face as if looking for something specific. Then, without warning, she took his hand and led him to a small improvised garden in crates in the corner of the yard. There, fragile seedlings tried to survive in poor soil. "Do you think they'll make it?" asked Danielle, her voice almost a whisper. It was the first time he had heard her speak directly to him. Richard felt a lump in his throat. "With the right care, I'm sure they will," he replied, moved by the involuntary metaphor of those little plants struggling to grow in adverse conditions, exactly like the 4 sisters. The next day, without anyone knowing, Richard sent an anonymous delivery to the shelter: fertilized soil, gardening tools, and various seeds. Danielle's smile upon discovering the new resources for her garden was the first genuine victory he felt on that uncertain journey. Parallel to his gradual approach to the girls, Richard intensified his investigation into the past. With resources and contacts that few possessed, he gained access to documents from the case that had condemned Lisa. What he discovered left him astounded. Lisa Miller had been sentenced to 4 years in prison for stealing basic food items: rice, beans, powdered milk, during the height of the pandemic when her 4 daughters were going hungry. The sentence, completely disproportionate for a low-impact offense and first occurrence, had been determined by a judge known for his heavy hand, but something didn't fit. Analyzing the records, Richard identified irregularities. Documents appeared to have been tampered with. Witnesses who could have favored Lisa were never heard. Appeals were systematically denied on technicalities. More disturbing still, the name of a law firm appeared discreetly in several petitions against Lisa's defense, the same firm that occasionally provided services to his family's company. One afternoon, while reviewing these documents in his office, Richard received an unexpected call from his sister, Victoria. "I heard you cancelled tomorrow's board meeting." Victoria's voice sounded cold on the other end of the line. "Any problem I should know about?" "Nothing important," Richard evaded. "Just needed to resolve some personal matters." "Personal matters," she repeated, with a touch of irony. "Since when do you have a personal life, dear brother? Your life has always been the company." The conversation ended with the promise of a dinner at the weekend, but left Richard uneasy. Victoria had always been the fierce guardian of the family's image and business. After their parents' departure, she had assumed the role of protecting the Matthews legacy, often with methods that Richard preferred to ignore. The following Sunday at the shelter, Richard was helping organize a small improvised library when Anna approached. Of all the girls, she was the one who maintained the most consistent distance. "Why do you keep coming?" she asked abruptly, with the frankness typical of a 10-year-old. Richard paused, holding a worn children's book. "Because I like to help," he replied, aware of the fragility of the explanation. Anna crossed her arms, incredulous. "No rich person does volunteer work every Sunday, especially someone like you." "Someone like me." "Betty researched you on the internet." "At the public library," explained Anna with an air of superiority. "We know who you are, Richard Matthews, CEO of Matthews Developments. Your company builds luxury buildings that cost millions. Why would someone like that come clean bathrooms? In a shelter?" Richard felt his stomach sink. He should have anticipated being discovered eventually. The girls were much more perceptive than he had imagined. "Sometimes," he began, choosing his words carefully, "people need something that money can't buy, something that makes real sense." Anna studied him for a long moment before extending her hand for the book he was holding. "This was my mother's favorite when we were little," she commented. "She read it to us every night, even after working all day cleaning houses of people like you." The acidity in the girl's voice was palpable, but there was also vulnerability. Richard carefully returned the book, noting the yellowed pages and the cover mended with tape. "Your mother seems to be an extraordinary person," he said sincerely. Anna's eyes briefly welled up before she regained her composure. "She is. And she'll come back to us." That night, Richard couldn't sleep. The image of Lisa reading to her daughters after an exhausting day of work contrasted painfully with the memory of his own behavior 12 years earlier. When she had tried to contact him about the pregnancy, he had completely blocked her, convinced it was an extortion attempt. After all, the doctors had been clear. He had been sterile since his youth. But if that was true, how to explain 4 girls with his eyes, his chin, the same face shape he saw in the mirror every morning? The next morning, Richard made a decision. He went to a discreet and specialized clinic where he requested a new complete fertility test. While awaiting the results, he intensified his investigation into Lisa's case. The trail led to disturbing discoveries. Substantial donations had been made to the charitable institute of the judge who had condemned Lisa. The prosecution had received an anonymous dossier with distorted information about her past, and, more alarming, all the letters that Lisa had tried to send from prison to her daughters had been systematically intercepted. Following this last clue, Richard gained access to copies of these retained letters. Reading them, he felt as if he had received a punch to the stomach. Lisa wrote with love, hope, and a dignity that contrasted with her situation. She told stories, gave advice, talked about plans for when they would be together again. In one, she mentioned the girl's father without naming him, only saying that he didn't know of their existence and that it was better that way. "Some people aren't prepared for the love you deserve," she wrote, "but that doesn't diminish who you are. You are my flowers, growing strong even in difficult soil." It was at that moment, reading those words, written on cheap notebook paper, that Richard felt the truth he had avoided for so long. Those girls were his daughters, and someone had actively worked to keep that truth hidden. When the test results arrived, they only confirmed what his heart already knew. The sterility diagnosis had been a mistake, or worse still, a deliberate manipulation. Richard was perfectly capable of having children. He always had been. On impulse, Richard called the private investigator and requested a comparative DNA test. The collection would be simple: a strand of hair, a toothbrush forgotten in the shelter's bathroom during one of his visits. But while talking on the phone, an uncomfortable sensation made him turn around. Victoria was standing at the door of his office, her face a mask of politeness that didn't completely hide the tension in her eyes. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, entering without being invited. "We need to talk about the new project in the Hamptons, and also," she added, placing a folder on the desk, "about your recent distractions. Richard slowly hung up the phone, aware that the approaching battle would be much more complicated than he had imagined. Behind the facade of perfection his family had always maintained, dark secrets were beginning to emerge, and at the center of them, 4 girls selling flowers on the streets of New York City. The folder Victoria placed on the desk contained photographs. Richard felt his blood freeze upon seeing them. They were images of him entering Bloom Shelter, carrying construction materials, talking with the girls in the garden. The last one showed him crouched beside Danielle, both tending to the seedlings in the small garden. "Can I know what this means?" asked Victoria, her voice controlled but laden with tension. The great Richard Matthews, heir to the Matthews Empire, playing gardener in a shelter for underprivileged children. "Do you have any idea of the risk you're taking?" Richard faced his sister, trying to decipher the true nature of her concern. "Risk? What risk can there be in helping needy children?" Victoria let out a dry laugh. "Please, Richard, don't insult my intelligence. These aren't just any children. They're that woman's daughters." She practically spat out the last words. You think I don't recognize those faces? That I didn't notice your sudden obsession with old documents, with that case that should have been buried?" The confirmation came as a shock. Victoria knew. She had always known. "You intercepted Lisa's letters," concluded Richard, feeling a growing anger. "It was you who manipulated the process, who ensured she received a disproportionate sentence. Why, Victoria? Why all this hatred?" "Hatred?" Victoria seemed genuinely surprised. "This isn't about hatred, Richard. It's about protection. Protection for you, for the company, for the legacy our parents built." She walked around the room, absently touching the expensive objects that decorated the environment. "When that woman appeared, pregnant, saying you were the father, I immediately knew what was at stake. Matthew's Developments was at a critical moment, expanding into international markets. Her scandal like that would destroy everything. So you used my sterility diagnosis to convince me it was impossible," concluded Richard, the pieces painfully falling into place. "But that diagnosis, it was fake, wasn't it?" Victoria's silence was answer enough. "My God, Victoria," murmured Richard, running his hands through his hair. "Do you have any idea what you did? 4 children grew up without a father. An innocent woman is in prison. And I lost 12 years I could have spent with my daughters." "Daughters?" Victoria let out a bitter laugh. "You don't even know if they're your daughters. That woman could have been lying." "The DNA test will confirm," replied Richard, determined. "But looking at them, I have no doubts. They have my eyes, my chin. They are my daughters, Victoria. And you knew it all along." Victoria's expression hardened. "And what do you intend to do now? Take in 4 children at once? Turn our family into tabloid headlines? Tycoon discovers quadruplets in shelter? Can you imagine the circus this will become?" "What I'm going to do," replied Richard, standing up, "is correct the mistake I made. I'm going to get Lisa out of prison and reunite my family." Victoria stared at him for a long moment, as if assessing her options. "You've always been the idealist in the family," she finally said, "but this time, you're going too far. If you insist on this madness, I'll have to take measures to protect what our parents built." "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning," she replied, heading to the door. "Think carefully about what you're doing, Richard. Some stones, once thrown, cannot be retrieved." After his sister's departure, Richard remained motionless, contemplating the photographs scattered on the desk. The girls' faces smiled at him in some, suspicious in others, his daughters. The truth resonated like a bell inside him, impossible to ignore. The next morning, the DNA test result arrived by email. Richard didn't even need to open the attachment to know what he would find. But the scientific confirmation brought a strange feeling of relief. 99.9998% probability of paternity. The 4 girls were unquestionably his daughters. Armed with this certainty, Richard hired Helen Vasquez, a renowned lawyer specializing in human rights. He explained the situation without omitting his own. Guilt in the initial abandonment. showing the evidence he had collected about the manipulation of Lisa's case. "It's a complex case," admitted Helen, after analyzing the documents. "There are clear signs of external interference, but we'll need more than suspicions to reopen the case. And there's another problem. Your sister. What about her?" Victoria. "Matthews is known in legal circles as someone with powerful contacts and unconventional methods. If she's determined to stop you, the battle will be difficult." Richard wasn't intimidated. "Do whatever is necessary. Money is not a problem." "It's not just about money," replied Helen seriously. "It's about time. While we wage this legal battle, what happens to the girls?" The question caught Richard off guard. In his eagerness to correct the past, he hadn't fully considered the present. "They're in the shelter, apparently safe for now." Helen shook her head. "Shelters are always subject to inspections, transfers, reorganizations. If your sister wants to complicate the girl's situation, there are ways." As if to confirm this fear, 2 days later, Mrs. Zelda called Richard in panic. A surprise inspection by Child Protective Services had resulted in a recommendation to transfer the girls to different institutions, citing overcrowding at Bloom Shelter. "They want to separate the girls," explained the coordinator, her voice choked. "They say it's not healthy to keep them together, that it reinforces problematic behaviors. It's absurd, they're sisters, they've always been together." Richard felt an icy fury spread through his body. The timing of the inspection, right after his confrontation with Victoria, couldn't be a coincidence. "They won't separate them," he guaranteed with a determination that surprised even himself. "I'll resolve this." The legal battle that followed was intense. Helen filed emergency appeals contesting the Child Protective Services decision. Richard, in turn, used his influence to attract media attention to the case, presenting it as an example of unjustified separation of siblings in the foster system. In parallel, he intensified his presence at the shelter. If before he went only on Sundays, now he appeared almost daily, bringing materials for renovation, organizing activities for the children, secretly financing improvements that made it more difficult to justify any transfer due to inadequate conditions. It was during one of these visits that Betty, the protector of the group, finally confronted him directly. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked, blocking his path as he carried paints for an art activity. "What's your real interest in us?" Richard hesitated. He still hadn't decided when or how to reveal the truth to the girls. Helen had advised caution, arguing that the revelation should come at an appropriate time, preferably with adequate psychological support. But Betty's challenging look demanded honesty. "I knew your mother," he finally replied, "a long time ago." The girl's eyes widened. "You knew our mother? How? When?" "We were friends," replied Richard, carefully choosing his words. "I lost touch with her before you were born. Only recently did I discover what happened." Betty studied him intensely, as if trying to detect any lie in his words. "And now you want to help because of her? Out of guilt?" The question, direct and incisive, revealed a maturity beyond the 10-year-old girl's age. Richard felt a mixture of pride and sadness for this daughter who had grown up too quickly, forced to be strong in a world that had denied her protection. "Yes," he admitted, "partly it's guilt. I should have been present. I should have believed her." Something in the sincerity of the response seemed to touch Betty. Her posture, always defensive, relaxed slightly. "Our mother always said that one day we would be together." Again, she commented with a rare vulnerability that it was just a matter of time, but it's been 2 years now. "I'm working to change that," assured Richard. "I promise." The moment of connection was interrupted by a commotion coming from the courtyard. Shouts and the sound of doors slamming filled the air. Richard and Betty ran to see what was happening. In the center of the courtyard, 2 men in suits accompanied by a social worker were trying to lead Caroline to a car parked at the entrance. The girl struggled, screaming for her sisters while Mrs. Zelda tried to argue with the officials. "You can't take her like this," protested the coordinator. "There was no prior notification. There is no specific court order." We have a judge's determination for immediate transfer, the social worker coldly replied, displaying a document. The minor Caroline Miller will be relocated to St. Clair Institute, as per judicial decision. Richard stepped forward, positioning himself between the men and the girl. This is illegal, he declared, with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Any transfer requires advance notification and must consider the child's best interest. Separating sisters contradicts all principles of the Child Welfare Act. And who are you? Questioned one of the men, visibly irritated by the interference. Richard Matthews, he replied, pulling out his phone, and I'm calling my lawyer, who has an injunction preventing any transfer of the Miller sisters until the conclusion of the case we're pursuing. The mention of his name caused a perceptible pause. Richard Matthews was known in the business and political circles of New York City. His influence was not something to be lightly ignored. We have no information about any injunction, argued the social worker, but her voice no longer sounded so confident. At that moment, as if answering an invisible call, the other three sisters appeared, positioning themselves beside Caroline. Anna firmly held Danielle's hand, while Betty placed herself in front in a defensive posture. We're not going anywhere without our sisters, declared Betty, with a courage that made Richard's heart swell with pride. The impasse was resolved, with the arrival of Helen, who electronically displayed the recently obtained injunction preventing any transfer of the girls. The officials, annoyed, withdrew after making veiled threats about consequences for the shelter. When the car finally departed, Richard noticed Caroline trembling despite the afternoon heat. Without thinking twice, he crouched down and hugged her. To his surprise, the girl didn't resist. On the contrary, she clung to him as if her life depended on that contact. They won't separate you, promised Richard, extending his arms to include the other three girls in the hug. I won't allow it. At that moment, surrounded by his daughters who barely knew him, Richard made a decision. It was time to reveal the truth with all its complications and uncertainties. It was time to assume his place as a father, regardless of the scandal, the consequences for business or Victoria's fury. What he didn't know was that, at that exact moment, a manila envelope was being delivered to the women's penitentiary where Lisa was serving her sentence. Inside it, a DNA test and a handwritten letter from Richard, explaining everything he had discovered and promising to bring her daughters back to her. The first step of a reconciliation that would still face many obstacles. The afternoon when Richard decided to reveal the truth to the girls was abnormally hot for that time of year. He had asked Mrs. Zelda for a private space, away from the curious eyes of the other children at the shelter. The coordinator, sensing the seriousness in the face of the man who had become a constant presence in recent weeks, offered her own office, a cramped cubicle with an old wooden desk and mismatched chairs. Helen, the lawyer, had insisted on being present. A revelation of this magnitude needs adequate mediation, she had argued. Richard agreed, grateful for the presence of someone with experience in delicate situations involving children. Anna, Betty, Caroline, and Danielle entered the room with expressions ranging from curiosity to distrust. They sat side by side, as they always did, a small army united by bonds stronger than blood, forged in shared adversity. Girls, Richard began, his voice trembling despite all the business meetings he had conducted with perfect composure. I need to tell you something very important, something that will change our lives. Is it about our mother? Interrupted Anna, always direct. Did something happen to her? No, nothing bad happened, he hastened to clarify. In fact, we're working to get her out of prison as quickly as possible. But what I need to tell you is about me and about you. Richard took a deep breath, seeking courage. How to explain 12 years of absence? How to justify having believed lies when he should have trusted Lisa? Many years ago, I met your mother. We fell in love, but our relationship lasted a short time. When we broke up, I didn't know she was expecting a baby, or rather 4 babies. The girls remained motionless, absorbing the information with indecipherable expressions. At the time, I believed I couldn't have children, Doctors had given me that diagnosis years before. So when your mother tried to tell me about the pregnancy, I didn't believe her. You abandoned our mother, concluded Betty, her eyes sparking with indignation. It wasn't a question, but an accusation. Richard nodded, accepting the guilt. Yes, and it was the biggest mistake of my life. If you didn't know about us, why did you start coming to the shelter? Asked Caroline, confused. How did you find us? It was by chance, explained Richard. I saw you selling flowers on Fifth Avenue. The resemblance was striking. You have the same eyes I see in the mirror every day. A heavy silence fell over the room. The girls exchanged glances, communicating in that silent language they had developed over the years. Are you saying you're our father? Finally asked Danielle, her voice almost a whisper. Yes, confirmed Richard, carefully placing the DNA test results on the table. I did a test to confirm, but deep down, I already knew. You are my daughters. The reaction was as varied as the personalities of the four sisters. Anna picked up the paper with the results, analyzing it methodically, as if looking for some flaw. Betty stood up, turning her back to hide the emotions fighting on her face. Caroline let out a small sob, while Danielle remained absolutely still, her large eyes fixed on Richard. Why are you telling us this now? Questioned Anna after examining the document. What do you want? The question, loaded with distrust, cut Richard like a knife. These children had learned too early that rarely does something come without a price. I want to correct my mistake, he replied with sincerity. I want to help free your mother and give you the family you deserve, if you'll accept me. And if we don't accept, challenged Betty, turning to face him, what happens then? Helen intervened gently. Nothing would change regarding the efforts to free your mother. That process would continue regardless of any decision about the relationship with Richard. It's true, confirmed Richard. My commitment to Lisa's release doesn't depend on you accepting me as a father. It's something I owe her, and you. Caroline, who had remained quiet until then, stood up and slowly walked to Richard. Without saying a word, she extended her hand and touched his face, as if confirming the so often mentioned resemblance. I always knew we had a father somewhere, she said, with touching simplicity. Mom never spoke badly of you. She only said that circumstances didn't allow us to be together. Caroline's words triggered something inside Richard. Lisa's generosity, protecting his image even after the abandonment, only amplified his guilt. How could she have been so noble while he had been so cowardly? Your mother is an extraordinary woman, he agreed, his voice choked. And you four are the proof of that. Danielle, who had remained silent, approached as well. With her small hand, she held Richard's. Are you going to take us to live with you? She asked, with the innocence that the hardships of life had not yet managed to completely strip away. If you want, replied Richard, gently squeezing his daughter's hand. My house has plenty of space, but I understand if you prefer to wait to get to know me better before making any decision. Anna and Betty remained reserved, observing their sister's interaction with caution. Richard respected their distance, knowing that the trust of the two more pragmatic girls would need to be earned with time and consistency. The following week, events precipitated rapidly. Helen managed, based on the new evidence, an extraordinary hearing for the review of Lisa's case. The judge, different from the one who had originally convicted her, showed himself receptive to arguments about the irregularities in the initial process. However, when everything seemed to be heading toward a favorable conclusion, a new obstacle arose. Lisa was abruptly transferred to a prison hospital under allegations of having been involved in a fight in the penitentiary. It's a lie, guaranteed Helen, after visiting the hospital. Lisa was never involved in any conflict. This is clearly a maneuver to hinder our communication with her and delay the process. Richard didn't need to ask who would be behind that maneuver. Victoria's shadow loomed over each obstacle that arose. His sister, as he had recently discovered, had diverted substantial resources from the family company to offshore accounts, probably to finance her manipulation schemes. Confronting her directly could be dangerous, especially with Lisa in a vulnerable situation. On a rainy afternoon, While the girls participated in school activities at the shelter, Richard received an unexpected visit to his office. Victoria, impeccably dressed as always, but with dark circles that betrayed sleepless nights. "You're destroying everything," she accused without preamble. "Did you know that the company's shares have fallen 7% since rumors began about your involvement with social issues?" "Investors are nervous, Richard. They don't like CEOs who suddenly develop social consciousness." "Let them be nervous," replied Richard, with a calmness that surprised them both. "Some values are more important than stock market quotations." Victoria laughed incredulous. "You really believe that? That you can simply trade everything we've built for an improvised family with an ex-convict and 4 shelter children? They are my daughters, Victoria, your nieces, and Lisa should never have been imprisoned. You know that better than anyone." The mention of the kinship caused something to change in Victoria's countenance. For a brief moment, Richard glimpsed a rare vulnerability in his always controlled sister. "You don't understand," she murmured, sitting heavily. "It was never just about the company or the scandal. It was about you." She avoided his gaze. "You were all I had, Richard. Our family was reduced to the 2 of us after our parents left. The idea of sharing you with another family, I couldn't bear it." The confession caught Richard off guard. Behind the cold and calculating manipulator was a deeply lonely woman whose distorted devotion to her brother had led her to unforgivable acts. "What you did was wrong, Victoria," he replied, firm but without resentment. "Innocent people suffered. Lisa lost years of her life. My daughters grew up without a mother, without a father, facing difficulties that no child should face. And now you want me to pay for it," she concluded, resigned. "You want to report me, expose everything." "I want you to help fix what you broke," Richard corrected. "Use your contacts, your influence to accelerate Lisa's release. After that, we'll have to deal with the legal consequences of what you did. I can't protect you from that." Victoria stood up, mechanically adjusting. "Her sake." Impeccable blazer. "Don't expect forgiveness, Richard. Not from her, not from the children. Some wounds are too deep to heal." "I don't expect forgiveness," he replied. "Just a chance to finally do what's right." 3 days after this conversation, to the surprise of Helen and the legal team, the review of Lisa's case was inexplicably accelerated. New evidence emerged, including testimonies from judiciary employees admitting they had received instructions to hinder the progress of the original process. In less than a week, Lisa Miller received an order for immediate release, with the right to compensation for wrongful imprisonment. The news reached Richard through Helen, who could barely contain her emotion on the phone. "We did it," announced the lawyer. "Lisa will be released tomorrow morning." Upon sharing the news with the girls, Richard witnessed something he would never forget: the rebirth of hope in 4 identical pairs of eyes. For the first time since he had met them, he saw all 4 smile simultaneously, without reservations, without fear of the future. The morning of the release dawned sunny, as if the sky itself were celebrating the event. Richard, accompanied by the 4 daughters and Mrs. Zelda, waited anxiously in the penitentiary parking lot. The girls had insisted on bringing flowers, not the ones they sold on the streets, but special bouquets they had secretly cultivated in the small garden at the shelter. When Lisa finally crossed the gates, Richard felt the world stop. 12 years had passed, but she still had the same determined look, the same dignity that had captivated him. Thinner, with premature strands of white hair, but unmistakably Lisa. The girls didn't wait for permission. They ran toward their mother, who knelt to receive them in an embrace that tried to compensate for 2 years of separation. Richard observed the scene from a distance, aware that this moment didn't belong to him. When Lisa finally raised her eyes and saw him, the expression on her face was indescribable, a complex mixture of surprise, confusion, and something he couldn't completely identify. "Richard," she called, uncertain, as if not believing what she saw. He approached hesitantly, not knowing exactly what his reception would be. "Hello, Lisa. It's been a long time." "The girls told me you found them," she said, still keeping her daughters close, as if fearing to lose them again. "That you discovered the truth." Richard nodded. "I discovered it too late. I'm sorry for what you went through, for what all 5 of you went through." Lisa studied him at length, as if assessing the sincerity of his words. "Why now, Richard, after so long?" "Because I finally found the courage to see beyond the lies I was told. Because your daughters, our daughters, taught me more about love and loyalty in a few weeks than I learned in my entire life." A small smile appeared on Lisa's lips, the first he had seen in 12 years. They have that effect on people. In the following weeks, a new routine was established. Richard found a spacious and comfortable apartment in Brooklyn, a middle-class neighborhood in New York City, and put it in Lisa's name, not as a gift, but as partial restitution for the lost time. The girls, after some supervised visits for adaptation, showed enthusiasm at the idea of living in a space where each would have her own room, something unimaginable after years of sharing bunk beds at the shelter. Lisa, initially hesitant to accept any help from Richard, eventually gave, and upon realizing that her resistance affected the daughters, who clearly wished to build a relationship with their newly discovered father. There was no romance between the adults. Old wounds didn't heal so easily, but mutual respect developed, a partnership focused on the well-being of the 4 girls. Anna was the first of the sisters to truly accept Richard. Her pragmatic nature made her recognize the advantages of having a father who could provide financial stability and new opportunities. Gradually, she lowered her guard, allowing herself to share with him her love for numbers and organization. Caroline, the artist, found in Richard an enthusiastic patron. He transformed one of the rooms in the new apartment into a studio, with quality materials she had never dreamed of possessing. Her joy upon receiving her first set of professional brushes brought tears to Richard's eyes, a gift so simple by his standards, so significant to her. Danielle, the youngest and most dreamy, adopted him without reservations, as if she had been waiting for him all her life. Her capacity to forgive and welcome moved everyone who witnessed her relationship with her father. Betty, however, kept her distance. While her sisters gradually made room in their lives for Richard, she remained resistant, observing with suspicion each attempt at approach. Her fierce loyalty to her mother and the vivid memory of years of struggle made forgiveness almost impossible. One Sunday afternoon during lunch at the new house, Richard found Betty alone on the balcony, contemplating the city. "They trust too easily," commented the girl, without looking at him. "They always have. Anna sees practical advantages. Caroline is enchanted by gifts. Danielle simply loves everyone. But You protect all of them," completed Richard, understanding. "It's your role, isn't it? It always has been." Betty finally turned to him, surprised at being understood. "I'm not asking you to trust me immediately," continued Richard. "I only ask for a chance to prove, with time and consistency, that I'm here to stay, that I won't abandon you again." VD, girl didn't respond, but something in her posture subtly changed. Not acceptance, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of a possibility. Parallel to the reconstruction of his family, Richard was reformulating his business empire. He created the Bloom Foundation, dedicated to supporting single mothers and children in vulnerable situations. He redirected investments to affordable housing projects and education in underprivileged communities. He dissolved partnerships with companies involved in dubious schemes, even when it meant significant financial losses. The market reacted with volatility to these changes. Some investors withdrew their support. Others, more aligned with the company's new vision, approached. The economic press speculated about a midlife crisis of the powerful CEO, while outlets focused on social issues celebrated the transformation. Victoria, as promised, had used her influence to accelerate Lisa's release. However, her past actions began to come to light. An independent investigation, initially focused on irregularities in Lisa's case, ended up revealing a pattern of manipulation, bribery, and document falsification that extended over years. The powerful executive now faced her own criminal process, isolated in the luxury apartment that had previously been her refuge. One Saturday morning, 6 months after Lisa's release, Richard arrived at the apartment to pick up the girls for a planned outing. He found Betty at the door holding an envelope. "It's for you," she said, extending it without explanations. Inside was a drawing. 4 girls holding hands with a tall man among flowering trees. In the lower corner, a simple signature. "From your daughter, Betty." The silent gesture of acceptance, so characteristic of the girl's contained personality, meant more than 1,000 words. Richard carefully tucked the drawing in his wallet, where it would remain for years as his most precious possession. 2 months later, on the girl's 11th birthday, the celebration took place in a flowery park near the new house. Lisa and Richard, side by side, watched the 4 run freely across the lawns, their laughter echoing in the afternoon air. "They're happy," commented Lisa, with a serene smile. "Lighter, more childlike." Richard nodded. "You built something extraordinary in them, Lisa. Your strength, your integrity, you did it alone under the most difficult circumstances." "I'm not alone anymore," she replied, without romance, but with a tranquil acceptance of the new reality they were building. "And they have the right to have a father." Richard observed his daughters, so physically identical, so unique in essence. Anna was organizing a game with meticulous rules. Caroline was drawing imaginary patterns in the air. Betty supervised everything, ensuring everyone's safety, and Danielle, always dreamy, contemplated a butterfly with infinite fascination. "Flowers that grew in difficult soil," he murmured, remembering the words from the letter he had never received. Lisa looked at him, surprised by the use of the metaphor she had always employed with her daughters. Exactly, and now they have the space to fully bloom. As the sun began to set, casting golden hues over the park, Richard understood the depth of the transformation those 4 girls had worked in his life. The man who once measured success in numbers and acquisitions now measured it in smiles, in drawings kept in his wallet, in small daily victories on the path to being a good father. The journey wasn't over. There were still healing wounds, trust being rebuilt day by day. But for the first time in his life, Richard Matthews felt truly rich. Not from the fortune accumulated in decades of ruthless business, but from the treasure discovered belatedly, 4 identical flowers that, against all odds, had found their way back home. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Richard and his 4 daughters has deeply touched your hearts. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally engaging stories. Find it here, clicking on the left. If you enjoyed this narrative about redemption, second chances, and the transformative power of family, love, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give the video a like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and human emotions in their various forms. Which character touched your heart the most? The protective, Betty, the organized Anna, the artistic Caroline, the dreamy Danielle, or perhaps Lisa's unwavering strength? Share your impressions in the comments. We look forward to seeing you in our next story, where once again